Today we're going to learn how to use one trig function to find them all. So remember, we know our little device for remembering sine, cosine, and tangent as SOHCAHTOA. So we know sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. We also have three other trig functions. So our first one is abbreviated CSC of theta, and this is actually called cosecant. And then we have another one, which is secant of theta, which is spelled secant and abbreviated SEC. And then we have cotangent of theta, which is abbreviated COT. And these trig functions, cosecant of theta is hypotenuse over opposite. You might realize that that is just sine flipped upside down, so this is actually just 1 over sine of theta. Secant of theta is hypotenuse over adjacent, or 1 over cosine of theta. So if you know what cosine is, you just flip the fraction to find what secant is. And last up is cotangent, which is adjacent over it is not. It is adjacent over opposite, which is 1 over tangent of theta. So these three functions are kind of paired with the one that I wrote across from it. And if you want a quick way to remember it, SC is like Santa Claus, so S goes with C. Now we're going to have all 6 functions, and if we know one, we can actually figure out the rest of them. So let's remember last time we were able to find the sine, cosine, and tangent for 3 basic functions. So we knew 30 degrees, sine was 1/2, cosine was square root of 3 over 2, and tangent we could figure out by doing sine over cosine, which we figure out to be square root of 3 over 3. Then for 45 degrees, you have sine is square root of 2 over 2, which is the same as what it is for cosine. And if you divide the two, you find that tangent is 1. And last up, for 60 degrees, we know sine is square root of 3 over 2, cosine is 1/2, and tangent is square root of 3. So these should kind of be 9 numbers that you can recall pretty easily, and you kind of have to memorize at first. Now, given one trig function, we know the rest of them. So given sine of theta equals 5/6, what you're going to do is draw a triangle that makes sense for what you're given. So if we know 5 over 6, then we have to figure out SOHCAHTOA, so this is opposite over hypotenuse. So what I'm going to do is draw a triangle that's a right triangle. And here's our theta. You can pick either one. Now the side opposite to it is 5, and the hypotenuse is 6. The first thing I have to do is figure out the other side. So let's just call this side x for now. Then I know by Pythagorean theorem, x squared plus 5 squared equals 6 squared. So x squared plus 25 is 36. So x squared is 11, which means x is the square root of 11. So let's go ahead and label this side as square root of 11. So you draw a triangle and then figure out other side with the Pythagorean theorem. Now we have everything we need to figure out all 6 trig ratios. So we know sine of theta is kind of helpful just to write them in order, is 5/6. Cosine of theta is adjacent over hypotenuse, or square root of 11 over 6. And tangent of theta is opposite over adjacent, so 5 over square root 11. But then we have to flip. because since there is a square root of 11, what we're going to do is multiply by square root of 11, both numerator and denominator, to get 5 square root of 11 over 11. And now we are going to figure out the other 3 trig functions. So we start with cosecant of theta, which is just across from sine. So it's just opposite of what sine is. So if sine is 5 over 6, cosecant is 6 over 5. Then cosine, opposite that is secant of theta. So if cosine is square root of 11 over 6, secant of theta is 6 over square root of 11, which we're then going to rationalize by multiplying by square root of 11 over square root of 11. So 6 square root of 11 over 11. And lastly, we have cotangent of theta. I'm going to show you a trick for this one. Rather than using this fraction, which will then, if we flip it, give us a square root in the denominator, try this first fraction. So if we flip this one, we get square root of 11 over 5. So now we have our 6 trig functions just by knowing that sine of theta is 5/6.